If you are a political aficionado of any kind, you may have noticed that in the last few elections, the Democratic Party has devoted an inordinate amount of energy to wooing the swing voter, especially the swing white voter, I would say. Our next guest has some thoughts on that. Steve Phillips is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He is the founder and chairman of Power Pack Plus, a social justice political network, and he is the author of a new book entitled Brown is the New White. Steve, thanks so much for the program.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, well, listen, let's start out this way by asking you, what is your book about?
Well, fundamentally, it's a wake-up call to the Democratic Party and to the progressive movement that they have to recognize that the population has changed dramatically and that they have to now start running towards voters of color instead of away from them if they're going to win. And that we have to focus in on increasing voter turnout of the base and of the growing numbers of people of color rather than spending money chasing the shrinking sector of the white swing voters, and that we have to move large amounts of money. The $2.7 billion will be spent in 20, well, it was spent in 2012. And if 46% of the voters are people of color, half of the money should be going towards those communities. And that's what we have to do if we're going to win in this new multiracial era and build on the successes of the Obama coalition.
So let me say a couple things in reaction to that. First of all, I'll break the interviewer persona a little bit and say, thank God somebody's saying that. Because, some of us have been looking at this for a long time and thinking, well, the party is really, if you look at those so-called swing voters, to the extent that they exist, they might be, you might know better than I, but they might be 1% of the electorate. If you look at issues of turnout, particularly in off-year elections, but in every election, turnout, number one, seems to be the game, and number two, certainly we hear a lot about the rising electorate, the new electorate that's being formed of Black and brown Americans primarily, as demographics shift, that you want to respond to that. So number one, amen, I guess I would say. And number two, the one thing you mentioned already was, how much money should be, and presumably effort as well, should be devoted to this voting bloc, which is roughly 50%. But that translates to policy proposals too, doesn't it?
Right, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the most important lessons of the past 8 years is that when we have run away from policies that are social justice policies, policies that advance equality and justice, people have been uninspired and they haven't turned out to vote. And that's what happened in 2010, in 2014, when the people in Congress who were up for reelection ran away from Obamacare, tried to run away from the president and not be associated with his agenda. But when the president stood up himself and ran for reelection and forcefully asserted that he was about a whole range of social justice policies, healthcare, immigration, equal pay, that then people came back out to vote for him in 2012. And so it very much is a policy-driven prescription. And that's part of the challenge that a lot of candidates are going to face in 2016.
Steve Phillips, author of the new book, Brown is the New White. Let me make a statement you might or might not agree with, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it. You're saying that, a lot of candidates have run away from the president and his agenda too much, and that was one of the lessons of 2014. I think that's arguably true. I would argue that at one point, even the president himself was seeming to low-key his own agenda. I'm thinking more of, let's say, maybe 2010, 2011. And then there was a point where, for whatever reasons of externalities, history, his own experience, he began to embrace his own agenda before the 2012 election. And I would argue that in the year 2012, the more he reaffirmed the agenda that got him elected in 2008, the better he did in the polls, and that was instrumental in his victory in 2012. What do you think of that interpretation?
Yeah, no, I actually agree with that completely. And I don't think things that I talk about in the book is a quote from Dan Pfeiffer, who was
Mm-hmm.
the advisor of the president, says that whenever you proposed anything that would be equality or social justice or moderately controversial, that everybody would be, well, how is this going to play in the red states, in the swing states? And so there's a great deal of timidity around passing the president's agenda. Somebody, a DC think tank leader, told me that there was a discussion between the president and Rahm Emanuel like 2009, and that Rahm said when he was chief of staff, "Oh, we shouldn't do that because it's only going to affect poor people and they don't vote." And then the president said, "We should do it. We just shouldn't talk about it." And I think that, whether that's true or not, I think that does encapsulate what the approach was for the first 2 years. I agree that, on the one hand, they were advancing significant policy prescriptions in terms of the economic measures around to bring the country back from recession, the immigration reform, the health care. But at the same time, they were not championing those policies that they themselves were promoting and putting themselves in the worst of both worlds. You actually, don't get the credit for it and you get all the blame.
Right. No, I think that's very, very well said. And I would also say, that to me is a fascinating anecdote. I'd read about Dan Pfeiffer saying, whenever we've gone progressive, we've never regretted it. But I had not heard that story about Rahm Emanuel and the president. And one of the things, of course, that comes to mind there is that you have Rahm Emanuel saying, let's not do it. You have the president, to his credit, saying, let's do it, but let's not talk about it. Of course, the unstated third option is let's do it. Let's help poor people in this country, even if they don't vote. And then let's go tell them and energize and mobilize them so that they do vote.
Right, exactly. And that's where I feel like the president in some ways was not well served by the strategic advice he was getting those first couple of years. That I was thinking, why don't we put the conservatives on the defensive around healthcare? I mean, how? And then supposedly they like to claim that they're the religious and faith-based party. What part of Christianity is that people should be denied healthcare, right? And so that the president could have been in swing states and could have been in local areas every month, every week, with the cameras that come with him, hugging somebody who now has healthcare, and then trying to drive that narrative that we're doing a good thing in this country. But it was only intermittent when they would affirmatively and enthusiastically embrace the very policies they were promoting.
You know what would have been a great state to do that? Would have been Kentucky, with the Connect program, which was extremely popular in that state and extremely effective. And now, of course, we're seeing a Republican governor who has his guns trained on it. But
Right.
now, let me ask you, though, in terms of that, sometimes you talk to progressives who say they feel frustrated with the Democratic Party because they feel like, we're the truisms at election time, but we're not the ones that get, if you will, taken to the prom. We're kind of just useful for getting out the vote or whatever. But how do progressives take the lessons that you're talking about in your book, Brown is the New White? How do they take that and mobilize, become more a part of the Democratic Party policy apparatus?
Well, that's what I wanted to make this book tool and, at some level, to extent appropriate, a manifesto for people who want to see these types of changes. And so we need more progressives running for office, and then more progressives holding elected officials accountable. I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a national progressive nonprofit organization who was friends with a person who ran for me, became a member of Congress as a Democrat, but then has continually taken a lot of bad votes, claiming that her district is too moderate, and so she can't support the things that she actually does support. And so, to one level, it's like, well, what's the point of that? But this person then says, well, I'm not doing any more fundraisers for you. I'm not helping you anymore if you're not going to actually stand up and fight for things. So there's a level of accountability that progressives can have. And then also in terms of the extent to which social media has democratized the influencing of public opinion, that there are ways to actually shine a light on and put pressure on the elected officials and the people running campaigns to ensure that they're doing their work in conjunction with the needs and the numbers of the new majority. But I think people will be responding. Everyone responds these days. When you mention someone on Twitter by name, that gets a response and that gets people's attention, and that democratizes the level of accountability we can have.
That's a great point. We're talking with Steve Phillips, the author of Brown is the New White. And I want to kind of see if we can close the circle a little bit on something here, Steve. And what I mean by that is the premise of your book, which I embrace and accept, is that we need to speak to the rising electorate of black and brown Americans who represent so much of the Democratic base. But isn't there the opportunity for some synchronicity too here with mobilizing the disenfranchised white voters as well? I mean, we've seen in recent months the new reports about disaffection and despair, the so-called deaths of despair among lower middle class white people, the increases in suicide and drug usage and alcoholism and so on. And it seems that this is a disaffected population too, who at least, perhaps not on the social justice level, but at least on the economic level, might have some issues very much in common with the black and brown electorate. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of examples of where there have been proposals to raise the minimum wage, which have been quite popular, but then candidates fearing who they think is the more moderate swing voter don't embrace them, right? So in 2004, John Kerry did not support the minimum wage increase that was on the ballot in Florida because he thought it was too controversial. It passed with like 70% of the vote, and he lost Florida. And similarly, in 2014, states like Arkansas, there was a minimum wage measure which passed, but the candidate who was running on the Senate side lost because he was so moderate and timid. So there's definitely examples of where the voting public is more progressive, actually, than the candidates may realize and appreciate.
Right. It almost feels sometimes as if Democrats, and it's a certain kind of Democrat, I should add, is reluctant to draw too much of a distinction between themselves and the Republican for fear that that will alienate this elusive base that we're talking about. But, I go back to that thing that Harry Truman never said. It's a misquote, but it's a good one. In a race between a Republican and a Republican, the Republican wins every time. I guess the last area I'd love to get your thoughts on, Steve Phillips, is authenticity. The sense that Democrats do better when they are authentic to their true selves and to their, what I would argue is hopefully their true nature as a party, which is a party of progressivism and justice. So you have any thoughts on the issue of authenticity?
Absolutely. And I think that that's what is also part of the lesson around what does it actually take to win, is that there's so much deference to what I call in the book the tyranny of the white swing voter, right? To the extent that Abraham Lincoln was on record as even saying, I support ending slavery, but I don't want there to be equality actually for black and white folks because, again, he was afraid of alienating that swing voter. But people who will stand up with authenticity and stand up with courage and conviction prevail. You look at Sherrod Brown in Ohio, who's run as an unapologetic populist in off-year elections and manages to win because voters respond to that. Keith Ellison, head of the Progressive Caucus and the Minnesota congressman, has actually increased voter turnout in off years when the voter turnout was plummeted elsewhere because he spoke strongly and authentically to the full diversity of his voting district, from renters to immigrants to Ethiopians to Latinos, and people came out. And that, I think, is the lessons that if you are true to who you are and you inspire who the actual voters are, you can and you will win.
And I think the term for that is leadership. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and marathon runner, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.